We are ready for chapter 25 of The Treasure Hunter's Tale. After breakfast, they spread the document out on the kitchen table. It was a will, as Mr. Saved by Grace had suggested, but it was not the kind that bequeaths possessions, but property. Indeed, this document had been missing for a long time. It showed that the proprietor had desired that the building would be used for good after his death. The will didn't state what the good was, but considering the building had clearly been used for an auction house, the men and Miss Poor in Spirit seriously questioned whether this will had been known at the time of the owner's death. Mr. Discover the Truth suggested they should do a little more investigating of the history of the building in the town library. This didn't sound like much fun to Freddie, but when Ears to Hear seemed enthusiastic too, it kind of rubbed off on Freddie, and so they all went off together, leaving Miss Poor in Spirit to look after the document. In the library, they had to go right to the back of the room, where they found some very dusty old books that were the town's records. There were books with records of births and deaths and transactions, and it was to this book they turned. Sure enough, they found the date the building was started, and then the date it was opened. They also saw that it had always been designed as an auction house, first for cattle, and then at one awful point it had clearly been used for the slave trade, where human beings were sold to other human beings as property. The name of the owner at that time matched the name on the will our hunters had found, so now everyone's interest was piqued. For the will had said for the building to be used for good, and no one would say that the slave trade had been good. However, on the next page there was an old newspaper article. It read, "Ex-slave trader converts to Christianity," and sure enough, there was the name again. "So maybe in his will he vowed to make amends by dedicating his building for good rather than evil," said Ears to Hear. "Then why did it go on to be an auction house?" queried Mr. Discover the Truth, "for I'm not sure we could call that using it for good." The others agreed. Then they came across the record of the deed being handed over, and oddly, the man's name did not appear. "Something fishy here," sniffed Mr. Saved by Grace, and then, turning to Freddie, he said, "Freddie, my boy, do us a favour and get the book on births and deaths, will you please?" Freddie got down on his hands and knees to look for the book titled Deaths. He lugged it up onto his lap, for it was very heavy, and opened up in the section with the letter of the man's surname as recorded on the will. As he was running his finger down the many names, he felt a tingle of excitement. Were they about to discover something? "Here it is," said Freddie after some searching. "That's odd," he said, peering closer at the old scrawly writing. "What is it, Freddie?" asked the men excitedly, for they too felt they were discovering something potentially exciting too. "Well, what's the date on the will, please?" asked Freddie. Mr. Discover the Truth recalled it. "And what's the date on the deed?" asked Freddie. Again, Mr. Discover the Truth read it out. "That's very odd," said Freddie again. The men were getting rather impatient. Freddie had obviously discovered something, but he was taking his time saying what it was, so they all crouched down and looked too. "That is odd," said Ears to Hear. "Very," agreed Mr. Saved by Grace. The dates did not make sense. If the owner had made his will known, then why had it not been obeyed? Why did his death date appear to be after the building was changed hands? "I think there is something sinister going on here," breathed Mr. Discover the Truth. "Freddie, is there a book down there of old newspaper clippings?" Freddie crawled along the line of dusty books, looking intently at the spines until he came to one that was called The History of Unreached. He hauled it back to the others, and Mr. Saved by Grace thanked him and picked it up. "I have a feeling this book might give us some answers," he said, excitedly thumbing his way through the pages. "Aha!" he said triumphantly a few tense minutes later. He showed the article to the others. It read, "Town Mayor Disappears." The article stated that the man whose name had been on the will had once been the town drunk, but had risen through the ranks and was a well-known slave trader. But when he had become a Christian, he had changed, and for the better, the article stated. It went on to say that through his work in the community and his conduct, he had been chosen for mayor by a majority vote of the people. Then there was a nice little piece about the changes he had made for the better, and then suddenly how he had disappeared and was suspected dead. A few pages later, there was an article that claimed the body of the mayor had been discovered and that police suspected foul play. "So someone didn't like him then?" breathed Ears to Hear. "Or maybe they knew about his will and wanted the building for their own use," suggested Mr. Saved by Grace. "Hang on, what was the name on the deed?" asked Ears to Hear. "A Baron Greed," read Mr. Discover the Truth. "Well, with a name like that, he clearly didn't love the king," observed Freddie. "Aye, and I wager that means he wasn't too keen on the owner either." Just then there was a cough, and an old lady with a fierce look was standing near them. "We're closing," she hissed, "and put them books back at once." "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Saved by Grace. "Are we allowed to borrow these, please?" The lady looked at the books. "Nothing doing," she said. "Those books stay in the building, see?" And she walked off. Someone doesn't want these books looked at, observed Ears to Hear. I wonder why they even have them on display. Well, we don't want to outstay our welcome, said Mr. Saved by Grace. Let's go and come back tomorrow. That evening the little group told Miss Poor in Spirit all they had discovered. The picture seemed to be forming from what they had gathered so far that the man who wanted to use the building for good had been thwarted by Baron Greed, and maybe even murdered by him. Miss Poor in Spirit shivered. She didn't think any of them should be discussing such things so close to bedtime, and she looked concerned at Freddie, for his eyes were shining brightly. Maybe we should pray about this and discuss it more tomorrow morning, she said firmly. Good idea, agreed the men. Good night, Freddie, and thank you for all your help today. They all made their farewells and departed, the three men to their lodging house, and Freddie and his grandmother upstairs to bed. That night Freddie prayed. He was sad for the nice mayor and thankful to the king for saving him before he died, but he was also thinking about the murder. What if the mayor was murdered for being a Christian? Was Baron Greed a wolf like the ones the officer had warned him about? Freddie fell into a fitful sleep and woke several times in a sweat. The next morning he was fidgety and anxious to get going. When the men arrived, Miss Poor in Spirit mentioned to Mr. Discover the Truth that she wasn't sure it was good for Freddie to get too involved with this latest adventure, and Mr. Discover the Truth nodded. Well then, Freddie, I think we won't go to the library today. That old lady seemed rather keen for us not to be there, so we'll give her some time to cool off, eh? Said Mr. Discover the Truth cheerfully. Freddie was about to object when Ears to Hear, who had overheard Miss Poor in Spirit's concerns, broke in. I wager there's some fine treasure to be discovered down in the woods. This distracted Freddie, and he looked at Mr. Saved by Grace. Aye, said Mr. Saved by Grace, and we haven't been there yet, and we might need you to climb some trees with us. That did it for Freddie. As most boys, the idea of climbing trees with his friends was too good an opportunity to miss. All right, then, he said. Can we have a picnic, please, grandmother? Miss Poor in Spirit smiled. Well, you'd better come and help me put something together then, Freddie, she said, and as he skipped off into the kitchen, she nodded her thanks to the hunters. About half an hour later, and laden with good things to eat, the happy band made their way off down the road towards the woods. The woods were called Ezekiel's Forest, and it was fairly easy going the first few 100 yards, and then all of a sudden it got very dense and tangled, and the path seemed to completely disappear, except for some cobbles that indicated that they were still on the right track. But my, how the brambles and briars caught at their heels and tore at their legs. Were it not for their swords, I think they would have surely turned back, but they slashed at the tangle in front of them and made good their progress. They came to a large tree which had low enough branches to climb, and so all four of them decided to climb up. They were so tired of only taking a few steps before needing to cut away the brambles that they were all very happy to be able to climb the large branches instead. Now, I don't know whether you have climbed any really old trees, not so old that they are restricted like the oak in Sherwood Forest, but old enough that they are big and sturdy. Well, these kind of trees seem to almost welcome climbers, so large and wide are their branches, and with so many footholds where birds have hollowed out a hole, or such large bulbous knots that make excellent resting seats. Anyway, this was such a tree, and the climb was very enjoyable. Ears to Hear stayed behind Freddie in case he needed help, but the young lad, who you must remember grew up climbing rigging, was very capable and made very good progress. They nearly reached the top when Mr. Saved by Grace called out, I think I found something. The other climbers crowded round. Mr. Saved by Grace had stopped level with a large nest hole, probably used by an owl. He pointed to the back of the hole, where there was a nail. This was very unusual to see, and obviously had been done by man. Hanging on the nail was a small purse. Mr. Saved by Grace motioned to Freddie. I think we need your small arms again, my boy, he said, moving aside. Freddie took a deep breath, for one should always be cautious when putting one's hand in a hole. As his hand felt around for the back of the hole, and then the nail and the purse, Freddie could feel the excitement building. It was obviously hung here by someone, so it must be special, he thought. The little purse was a velvet one, and as they all looked inside, they saw a lot of little carved stones. They were in the shape of hearts, and on them were different words. They all decided it wouldn't do to be trying to figure out what the hearts meant while they were up in the tree, and so began the climb down. They stopped halfway down to rest, and because the branches were so wide at this point, they stopped to have their lunch. It was jolly being able to sit up so high and swing one's legs back and forth while munching sandwiches, and Freddie felt very happy. He loved being a treasure hunter, and he was really looking forward to discovering what the little carved hearts meant. They finished their lunch and began to climb down again. On the way back down, Ears to Hear noticed someone had carved something into the tree, and he made a mental note of what it said.